The shells had been wrong for months. Lieutenant Marcus Cole knew this the way a farmer knows bad soil, not through science, but through the slow accumulation of failure. His battery had fired over 8,000 rounds at the German V-1 flying bombs screaming toward Antwerp, and they had hit exactly 19 kills from 8,000 shells. His men had stopped cheering. They had stopped hoping. Now they simply fired and watched the rockets pass overhead, trailing their strange buzzing sound toward the port where Allied supplies sat waiting to feed the push into Germany. December in the Ardennes was a kind of cold that made men forget warmth had ever existed. Marcus stood in a command post, a sandbagged pit that smelled of cigarette smoke and wet wool, and watched his breath form clouds in the lamplight. The radio crackled with reports of another V-1 wave incoming. 12 rockets, maybe 15, launched from mobile sites somewhere in the German-held forest. His men would fire. The rockets would pass. Soldiers in Antwerp would die. This was the rhythm of his war now. The convoy arrived without warning, 3 trucks under heavy guard, moving without headlights through the frozen darkness. A captain Marcus didn't recognize handed him orders sealed with classification stamps he had never seen before. The orders said nothing useful. Accept delivery. Maintain silence. Await further instruction. The trucks carried crates marked only with serial numbers, and the soldiers who unloaded them wore no unit patches on their uniforms. A man in civilian clothes stepped out of the lead truck. He was perhaps 50, with the soft hands of someone who had never held a rifle and the hard eyes of someone who had seen things worse than combat. He introduced himself as Dr. Elias Roth and offered no further explanation. He told Marcus his battery had been selected for a field trial of new ammunition. He told Marcus the new shells were to be used exclusively against aerial targets. He told Marcus that regardless of the results, no reports would be filed, no records kept, and no word spoken to anyone outside this frozen pit in the Belgian forest. Marcus wanted to argue. He wanted to demand explanations. But he had been in the army long enough to recognize when questions would not be answered, and the classification stamps on those orders suggested consequences he did not want to imagine. He accepted the crates. He watched his men load the strange shells into the guns. He noticed the shells looked almost identical to standard ammunition, except for small glass components visible in the nose. He said nothing. The V-1s came at 0347 hours. Marcus heard them before he saw them, that distinctive pulse-jet drone that soldiers had learned to fear, the sound of a mechanical heartbeat carrying 500 kilograms of explosives towards sleeping cities. His spotters called the range. His gunners elevated their weapons. Marcus gave the order to fire. The first shell left the barrel with the familiar thunder of a 90mm gun. Marcus watched its tracer arc toward the leading V-1, expecting the usual result, a miss by dozens of feet, the shell exploding uselessly in empty air while the rocket continued its deadly flight. Instead, the shell detonated exactly 15 feet from the V-1's fuselage. The explosion tore the rocket apart. Flaming wreckage tumbled from the sky. His men froze. Marcus froze. In 18 months of combat, he had never seen anything like it. The second V-1 approached on a parallel track. Another shell fired. Another detonation at precisely the right distance. Another kill. The third rocket died the same way. The fourth. The fifth. In 3 minutes, his battery destroyed 5 V-1s with 7 shells, a kill ratio that should have been mathematically impossible. Sergeant Danny Kowalski, a Chicago steelworker who had stopped believing in miracles somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy, lowered his binoculars with shaking hands. His voice came out as a whisper. "Lieutenant, what the hell are these things?" Marcus had no answer. He turned to find Dr. Roth standing at the edge of the command post, a small notebook in his hands, writing observations in handwriting too small to read. The civilian's face showed no surprise, no excitement, only the calm satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. "You performed well tonight," Roth said. "Your battery will receive additional supplies. Continue using them against aerial targets only. Land-based targets are forbidden." If any shell fails to detonate, report the location immediately, recovery teams will be dispatched within hours. He paused, and for the first time, something like emotion crossed his face. What happened here tonight does not exist. These shells do not exist. You will discuss this with no one. The war depends on it. He was gone before Marcus could respond, climbing into the lead truck, disappearing into the darkness. Marcus stood alone in the command post, surrounded by men who had just witnessed the impossible, holding shells that could think, that could find their targets without human guidance. He understood nothing about the technology. But he understood one thing clearly: somewhere in America, someone had built a weapon that changed everything. And he was one of the first men alive to see it work. 300 miles east, in a Luftwaffe intelligence office, a reconnaissance photograph would arrive by morning, 5V-1 wrecks in a perfect line, destroyed by a single battery in under 3 minutes. The officer who received it would stare at the image for a long time, running calculations that produced impossible results, before picking up his telephone and placing a call to Berlin. The 12th shell was missing. Sergeant Anna Bryce counted again, moving her flashlight across the frozen rubble, her breath coming in short gasps that fogged the air and obscured her vision. 11 shells recovered. 11 small miracles of American engineering dug from the wreckage of a Belgian village that no longer had a name. But the firing report said 12, and 12-11 left one shell somewhere in this wasteland of shattered stone and frozen corpses, one shell containing secrets that could not fall into German hands. Anna had never expected to be here. She had joined Allied intelligence in London because she spoke German fluently and could type 60 words per minute, skills that seemed suited to warm offices and decoded messages. Instead, she had become a hunter of lost technology, part of a shadow unit that tracked every proximity fuse shell fired in the European theater. The VT fuse, they called it, variable time, a name designed to reveal nothing. Inside each shell sat a miniature radar set, a transmitter and receiver small enough to survive being fired from a cannon, sophisticated enough to detect a target and trigger detonation automatically. The Germans had nothing like it. If they captured even one intact fuse, their engineers might close the gap within months. The village had been called Saint-Marin before the war. Now it was coordinates on a map, a place where American and German forces had clashed in confused night fighting 3 days ago. An artillery battery had fired VT shells in the chaos, against orders, against protocol, against every security measure designed to keep the technology from falling into enemy hands. Now Anna and a 4-man recovery team were digging through rubble while German patrols probed the perimeter, searching for something the size of a coffee thermos that could change the course of the war. Private First Class Tommy Reeves found the 11th shell wedged under a collapsed beam. Anna marked its location, photographed the site, and supervised its careful extraction. The shells were designed to self-destruct on impact, but sometimes they failed, landing in soft ground, striking at odd angles, burying themselves before the detonation mechanism could trigger. Each unexploded shell was a ticking clock, a secret waiting to be discovered. "That's 11, Reeves said, his young face pale in the flashlight beam. "Maybe the 12th detonated. Maybe we're looking for something that doesn't exist anymore." Anna wanted to believe him. The mathematics of probability suggested he might be right. Most shells functioned as designed, destroying themselves along with their targets. But her orders left no room for probability. Find all 12. Confirm destruction or recovery. Accept no uncertainty. She sent Reeves to check the eastern ruins while she moved toward a collapsed farmhouse at the village edge. The building had taken a direct hit from something large, a tank shell, perhaps, or a German mortar. The walls had pancaked inward, creating a maze of broken timber and shattered brick. Anna crawled through a gap barely wide enough for her shoulders, her flashlight revealing a basement space that had partially survived the collapse. That was when she heard the voices. German. 2 men, maybe 3, speaking in the clipped tones of soldiers conducting a search. They were close, perhaps 50 meters, perhaps less. Anna killed her flashlight and pressed herself against the cold stone, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain they could hear it. The Germans were looking for something too. She understood fragments of their conversation, unusual debris, intelligence value, orders from Berlin. Someone in the German high command had noticed the impossible kill ratios. Someone had sent teams to search the same battlefields Anna's unit was searching, hunting for the same prize. She waited in the darkness for 20 minutes, listening to boots crunch through rubble, listening to German voices grow closer and then fade. When silence returned, she switched on her flashlight with trembling hands and continued her search. The basement was small, a root cellar, perhaps, or a wine storage space. She found broken bottles, moldy potatoes, the skeleton of a rat. No shell, but in the corner, half buried in debris, she found something else, a German soldier's pack, abandoned in the chaos of the fighting. Inside the pack, wrapped in a wool scarf, sat a metal cylinder the size of her forearm. The glass nose was cracked but intact. The serial number matched her list. Shell number 12. Anna's hands shook as she secured the fuse in her own pack. The German who had found it was gone, dead in the fighting, perhaps, or captured, or simply separated from his equipment in the confusion. He had recognized the shell as unusual. He had kept it. And he had lost it before reaching anyone who might understand what it was. She crawled back through the rubble and signaled her team. 12 shells recovered. Mission complete. The secret was safe, for now, but as they moved toward the extraction point, Anna could not shake the knowledge that somewhere in Berlin, men were studying photographs of impossible kill ratios, running calculations that didn't make sense, asking questions that would eventually lead them to the truth. The proximity fuse was a secret measured in time, not in silence. And time, in war, was the one resource no one could manufacture. The shell sat on Dr. Werner Fassbinder's workbench like an unexploded bomb, which in a sense it was. Not because it might detonate, the ordnance teams had verified it was inert, but because the secrets inside threatened to destroy everything Werner had believed about German technological superiority. He had spent 3 days disassembling the device, documenting each component with the methodical precision that had made him the Reich's leading electronics specialist. Now, staring at the collection of parts spread across his laboratory table, he understood why General Heinrich Voigt had summoned him from his radar research with such urgency. He also understood why the war was already lost. The Americans had built a radar set that fit inside an artillery shell. Werner repeated this fact to himself because his mind kept rejecting it, kept insisting it must be a mistake, a misidentification, a captured German prototype somehow misattributed to the enemy. But the components were unmistakably American, the vacuum tubes marked with factory codes from manufacturers in Massachusetts and Ohio, the circuit boards designed with an elegance that German engineering had never achieved. The entire assembly was smaller than Werner's fist. It had survived being fired from a cannon at velocities that should have destroyed any electronic device. It had detected an aircraft in flight and triggered its own detonation with split-second precision. Germany had been trying to build something similar since 1940. They had failed. They had concluded the technology was impossible with current manufacturing capabilities. And the Americans had apparently built thousands of them. Werner's laboratory occupied the basement of a Berlin building that shook with increasing frequency as Allied bombers visited the city nightly. He worked by the light of a single lamp, conserving electricity that had become precious. His assistants had been reassigned to more urgent projects, the desperate scramble for wonder weapons that might reverse Germany's collapsing fortunes. He was alone with the shell, alone with the truth it represented. He began writing his report on the third night, after the evening air raid had ended and the all-clear sirens had faded into silence. The words came slowly, each sentence a small betrayal of the confidence his superiors had placed in German science. The American proximity fuse represents a fundamental breakthrough in miniaturization technology. Replication would require manufacturing precision beyond current German industrial capabilities. Conservative estimates suggest a minimum of 24 months to achieve comparable production, assuming unlimited resources and no further Allied bombing of industrial facilities. Neither condition can be met. He wrote until his hand cramped, filling pages with technical analysis that led to a single unavoidable conclusion: the Americans were not just winning the war through numbers and resources. They were winning it through science. They had built something Germany could not build, using techniques Germany did not possess, at scales Germany could not imagine. General Voigt arrived the next morning, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos consuming Berlin, his face arranged in the careful blankness of a man who had learned to show nothing. He read Werner's report in silence, his eyes moving across the pages without expression. When he finished, he set the report on the workbench beside the disassembled fuse. "This conclusion is unacceptable," Voigt said. "The Führer requires evidence that our enemies can be defeated. This report provides no such evidence." Werner had expected this. He had prepared for it, rehearsing arguments in his mind through sleepless nights. "General, I can only report what the evidence shows. The Americans have achieved miniaturization we believed impossible. If we cannot acknowledge this reality, reality is what the Reich requires it to be." Voigt's voice carried no anger, only the flat certainty of a man who had learned to survive by believing convenient lies. "Rewrite the report. Emphasize the fuse's limitations. Suggest countermeasures. Provide hope. There are no countermeasures. The fuse works by detecting radar reflections from the target. The only defense would be to make our aircraft invisible to radar, which is impossible." "Yes. So you will write that the fuse is effective only under specific conditions, that it can be fooled by simple evasive maneuvers, that our pilots need only adjust their tactics." Voigt picked up the report and tucked it into his briefcase. "This version will be destroyed. You will produce a new version within 48 hours. Am I clear?" Werner said nothing. Voigt studied him for a moment with eyes that had watched better men break under simpler pressures, then turned and left without another word. That night, Werner began a second report, the real one, the one he hid inside a hollowed-out book on his shelf. He calculated backward from the fuse, estimating the industrial capacity required to produce millions of such devices. The numbers were staggering. The factories, the engineers, the raw materials, the quality control systems, each calculation revealed new depths of American strength that German intelligence had never grasped. The proximity fuse was not a weapon. It was a message. It said, "We can build what you cannot. We can think what you cannot. We have already won, you simply do not know it yet." Werner's hands trembled as he wrote. His colleagues noticed he had begun talking to himself, muttering figures and formulas as he walked the corridors. Sleep came rarely and brought no rest. He had looked into the heart of American power and seen something that terrified him more than any bomb, a future where machines made decisions faster than human minds could follow, where wars were won in laboratories years before the first shot was fired. The war would end. Germany would fall. But Werner understood now that this was only the beginning. Whatever came next would be shaped by men who could build thinking shells, and he was not among them. The war ended not with silence but with a sound Marcus Cole would never forget, the continuous thunder of artillery shells bursting 20 feet above German trenches, each detonation perfectly timed by the same technology that had seemed like magic in the frozen Ardennes 4 months ago. Now there was no magic, only mathematics, only the relentless efficiency of weapons that found their targets without fail. His battery had crossed into Germany itself, advancing through towns where white sheets hung from windows and hollow-eyed civilians watched American trucks roll past with expressions beyond despair. The proximity fuse was no longer secret. It was everywhere. Marcus stood in the ruins of a town called Wesel, watching his men load fresh VT shells into guns that would fire them at targets retreating toward a Reich that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The shells worked exactly as they had that first night, detecting targets, calculating distances, detonating with terrible precision. German soldiers died by the hundreds under airbursts they could not escape, killed by shrapnel that fell from above like metal rain. His men had become efficient. They no longer flinched at the results of their work. Neither did Marcus, and that absence of feeling frightened him more than the killing ever had. 300 miles east, Anna Bryce drove a requisitioned Mercedes through the rubble of what had been central Berlin, following coordinates that led to a bombed university on the city's western edge. Her mission had changed. The proximity fuse was no longer a secret worth protecting. The war's final months had seen it deployed openly, its existence acknowledged, its capabilities demonstrated beyond any possibility of concealment. Now her orders involved a different kind of recovery: scientists. The Soviets were racing to capture German technical expertise before the Western Allies could reach it. Men who had built rockets and radar and weapons of terrible ingenuity were suddenly valuable prizes in a new competition that had already begun beneath the surface of the dying war. She found Dr. Werner Fassbinder in a basement laboratory, sitting among the wreckage of equipment that Allied bombs had rendered useless. He was thinner than his file photographs suggested, his eyes carrying the particular emptiness of a man who had seen too much and understood too well. He did not resist when Anna identified herself. He did not ask where she would take him. He simply reached into a hollowed-out book on a nearby shelf and withdrew a folder of handwritten pages. "I have been waiting," he said in accented English, "for someone to find me. I hoped it would not be the Russians." He held out the folder. "This is my real work. The analysis my superiors refused to accept. Perhaps your people will find it useful." Anna took the folder without reading it. She would learn later what it contained: calculations that traced the proximity fuse backward to its industrial origins, revealing the vast machinery of American production that had made such weapons possible, predicting with eerie accuracy the shape of the technological competition that would define the coming decades. Werner had understood, alone in his basement while Berlin burned, that the proximity fuse was not merely a weapon. It was a prophecy that in a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, General Heinrich Voigt stood before a desk covered with intelligence reports he no longer bothered to read. Soviet artillery shook the walls. The Führer was dead, the government scattered, the thousand-year Reich reduced to rubble and ash. Voigt had spent the war's final weeks assembling a complete picture of the proximity fuse, captured documents, interrogation transcripts, technical analyses from scientists who had been more honest than Werner. He understood now what he had refused to understand when the first impossible kill ratios crossed his desk: the Americans had built 22 million proximity fuses by war's end. 22 million tiny radar sets, each one a miracle of miniaturization that German industry could not have replicated with 5 more years and unlimited resources. The fuses had destroyed 85% of the V-1 rockets targeting Antwerp. They had turned Japanese kamikaze attacks from deadly threats into futile sacrifices. They had burst above German trenches with timing so perfect that no foxhole provided shelter. Voigt had spent his career believing that will and courage could overcome material disadvantage, that German spirit would triumph over American factories. The proximity fuse had proved him wrong in the most fundamental way possible. It was not about spirit. It was about thinking machines, about weapons that made decisions faster than human minds could react, about a future where wars would be won by those who could build the smallest, smartest, most precise instruments of death. He burned his papers methodically, feeding them to a small fire in a metal wastebasket. He put on his dress uniform, the one with all his decorations, the one he had worn when he still believed victory was possible. He wrote a single sentence on a blank sheet of paper: "We built better tanks. They built better thinking." Then he sat down at his desk and waited for the end. Marcus Cole would return to Ohio after the war, to a farm his grandfather had worked and a life that seemed impossibly quiet after years of thunder. He would never speak of the proximity fuse, not because of security oaths but because he could not find words for what it meant. He had held the future in his hands that night in the Ardennes, a future where machines would think, where weapons would choose their own targets, where the line between human decision and mechanical calculation would blur beyond recognition. He had seen the beginning. He did not want to imagine what came next. Anna Bryce would continue her work in intelligence, tracking technologies rather than fuses, watching the Soviets and Americans race to build things that made the proximity fuse look primitive. Werner Fassbinder would spend 20 years in American laboratories, contributing to guidance systems and radar improvements, never quite escaping the memory of that basement in Berlin where he had first understood that his country's defeat was written in the circuits of a device smaller than his fist. The proximity fuse was real. It changed the war. It changed everything that came after. And somewhere in its legacy, in missiles that found their targets, in sensors that detected without human eyes, in the endless cascade of thinking machines that would reshape the world, echoed the sound of shells bursting over frozen Belgian forests, announcing a future no one had asked for and no one could stop.